Arterial has an emphasis on mobility. It's not great for access. Access is controlled in a lot of cases. Collectors are kind of in the middle of the range. Local streets are on the other end. So a street in a subdivision, a residential subdivision, would typically be a local street. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. So the design of an arterial is 3 to 6 lanes plus sidewalks, 120 feet of width for right-of-way. The right-of-way is the entire area that's dedicated to the public or is owned and operated by the public, but includes the sidewalks, curb and gutter. It can include grassy medians or parkway strips. Collector is generally designed, or the design standards for a collector, this comes right out of the Gardner technical specifications. It's 2 to 3 lanes plus sidewalks, 60 feet wide right-of-way. A local street is 2 lanes plus a sidewalk or sidewalks. I believe our standards call for or require a sidewalk on one side of the street only. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to look at the subdivision regulations, but that's the way it's stated in the technical specifications. And the right-of-way width is 50 feet. Access controls reduce traffic conflicts. They allow for higher speeds and greater volume, and they're often difficult to implement. They can be sometimes inconvenient. So what you'll find on larger arterials with a lot of traffic is the jurisdiction will put in medians that don't allow you to take a left turn. Where I see this most, I think this is most noticeable up on 135th and Olathe. It's hard to get into some of those lots, but that does a lot to reduce conflicts and speed the traffic flow.
And that's what they did on Moonlight when they redid that.
Yes. So a lot of older streets, they haven't implemented these ideas, but as new streets get built, they do implement those ideas. Types of access controls: minimum distance between access points like driveways, minimum distance between access points and street intersections, and maximum width of access. I don't know the specific numbers, but they're somewhere in, like for an arterial, the minimum distances, the standard or the guidelines is something like 400 feet. Obviously, if you look at some of the arterials in Gardner, that's not what you see. It's difficult to implement them. Usually what happens is you try to implement them as best you can through the development review process or as streets are built by the jurisdiction. So this is the future land use map in the community development plan. Arterials are generally spaced 1 mile apart on section lines. A section is a square mile. Collectors are at the midpoint, generally speaking, between the arterials. So you end up having a through street every quarter mile, generally speaking. If you look at this map, there are some areas that do not have a through street every quarter mile. That relates to the connectivity of the area and the ease of getting from point A to point B within, say, a neighborhood. There are kind of different philosophies about how to design streets, how many through streets you should have, but this is fairly common that you have arterials at every mile and collectors in between. So this is a map. I just snipped this out of Ames, and this is of Center Street. Center Street is the north-south street in the center, and then Cherokee Street, or also known as 183rd, is the cross street. Center Street is an arterial. As you can see, the access points are limited. In some cases, you can see where they have not been able to implement yet the standards for an arterial. I don't have the ability to point on the screen, but if you can kind of make out where the park is at Pawnee and Center Street, and just to the south of that, I believe that's a church. And you can see how the church has 2 points of access. Can you see that on the screen? It has 2 points of access to the parking lot. I think if that church has been there for a while, I don't know exactly what all took place, but I have a feeling if that church wasn't there today, and if they came in tomorrow to apply for site plan review or what have you, they'd be limited to one point of access because of the access control that's implemented on arterials in Gardner. That's fairly common in the transportation engineering field to do that. It's current, contemporary, conventional thinking on controlling access on arterials. Cherokee Street, it's a collector. There are more access points. Currently in the subdivision regulations, there's no restriction, I don't believe, for residences to take direct access for collectors. I think that it is a guideline. I don't know specifically. I don't know, Michelle, if you've looked at that. But I don't think there is specific restriction on direct access to a collector. There are some issues with that, partly because of traffic safety and mobility. And there's a land use transportation conflict potentially as people try to, being on a collector or an arterial, if there's a lot of traffic and you have to take direct access onto that street, it can have a detrimental effect on property values as traffic increases over time. So there are different ways to address that. And one way to do that is to require a buffer strip along a collector, buffer strip along an arterial between residential subdivisions, and only allow access from the other side. And so the lots would back up to those streets. So that is what I have for transportation. Are there any questions about anything I just went over? Any comments? Okay.
Good.
Okay, so this next...
I have one quick one, sorry.
Sure.
When you have old, like the church example,
Yeah.
old existing designs that wouldn't pass today, is it very common for problems to come up where we have to address something like that, where maybe something becomes hazardous and a change has to be made, or is that not common at all?
I'd say it'd be uncommon to, or possibly not legally defensible, to force someone to close their access. Access is protected generally by property owners, more so by retail businesses than, say, a church. But typically it just happens when there's new development or a change. Let's say that they added on to the church and they wanted to add on to their parking lot, and the current standard says that they're only allowed one access or they're required to share access where possible, then a decision would have to be made. If it's an application that is before the Planning Commission, a decision would have to be made by the Planning Commission whether to grant them the access or grant them some relief from what the current standards say. There tends to be a lot of kind of give and take on those transportation access controls. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn by saying that, but I think there generally is. It's just, they're just difficult to implement and they're painful for a lot of people. So like on Main Street here, a lot of access points. A lot of those properties were developed a long time ago before there were access controls. Recently, we reviewed a site plan. It was not something that went to the commission. It was done by staff. And the access management, well, it's a US 56 corridor study, actually, I believe, that said that we should require them to combine access. But they were doing such a minor, they weren't making very many improvements to their buildings, so it seemed unreasonable. You know, some judgment has to go into it. So one could argue that, oh, this is an opportunity to implement the plan and require them to combine access and have common access with the lot next door. But that would have cost them a lot of money to do that. It probably would have been out of proportion with what they were doing. And you have to be a little careful about doing something that's not proportional to the project. So this next set of slides, it's on urban design. This is one of the more subjective topics. Urban design is kind of how you define it. I would say anything, any physical planning